So recently I finally read Fire Punch. For a long time, a lot of you have been asking me, please read Fire Punch. You will 100% enjoy it. If you like Chainsaw Man, you're gonna like Fire Punch. So I listened, I finally read it, and I agree. I genuinely enjoyed it. I think the reading experience is enthralling and captivating and something rather unique, to be honest. It's definitely an experience that you don't get all too often. I guess it kind of depends on what you read on a daily basis. Fujimoto's, I believe, first work is a very interesting one. And even though I did wholeheartedly enjoy it, I still have my complaints, my issues that I believe are somewhat justified or warranted. So where do we begin? Going into Fire Punch, I didn't necessarily know what to expect. I had some lingering ideas just based off the reception towards Chainsaw Man and the things that I've seen people talk about regarding Chainsaw Man and how they link that back to Fire Punch. So in some sense, I was expecting maybe something similar to Chainsaw Man, if that, to some sort of portion or degree. Do you get that? Somewhat. A very minuscule amount, but it's somewhat there. I see the comparison. But Fire Punch is on a whole different level. It is somewhat the complete opposite of what Chainsaw Man is. By its tone, its atmosphere, its concept and themes, even its characters and what they represent and how they're focused on is inherently different from Chainsaw Man. It's not necessarily a bad thing, and I'm not even explaining it as a bad thing. If anything, I think it's a rather good thing, as Fujimoto seems to have learnt a lot of things from Fire Punch and has either corrected them within Chainsaw Man or at least fallen back or got rid of them completely within it. Fire Punch basically being the stepping stones to a much larger and well-deserved success. Fire Punch is relatively short in comparison, I believe only having 80 odd chapters, so it's a rather palatable read. You could probably do it in a day if you really wanted to, but something that is extremely consistent within it is its atmosphere. This is where I think Fujimoto has done something absolutely incredible that you don't actually see all too many authors doing today, focusing on nihilism. And while it is a pretty standard concept and a lot of stories do that, the amount they play on it varies drastically. A lot of stories just use it here and there, but some of the best stories that you will ever read that involve nihilism are basically that at its core. They don't just use it whenever they want. It is every single concept, idea, character, thing, or motive that intertwines so beautifully to create such a profound atmosphere. It's like everything working in perfect sync or tangent to create and uphold that nihilistic nature so incredibly well. At this point, nihilism is somewhat evolving into its own genre. It's basically just super depressing in every single facet. There's no meaning in anything. There's no meaning in life, in emotions, into learning, into knowledge, into this, into that. Everything just means nothing. So the existence means nothing. And you can see how that can be played around with in a lot of different ways. And Fire Punch does do that extremely well. And it does not hold back either. I should probably clarify that. It really goes above and beyond to show the gritty nature of this story, the people within it, and the world that they inhabit. Everything is dark, depressing, and deathly around every single corner. The chances of you dying or being killed is around about 80 to 90%, if that. What I mean when I say that Fire Punch uses nihilism and the concept surrounding it extremely well and honestly impressive for what I believe is Fujimoto's first work, is that it is imbued into pretty much everything, from Agni as a main character, to the world that they're within, to how the people within that world are trying to survive and live, to the very specific and minimalistic abilities, to the perception of Agni and other people within the world. Everything has some sort of link or connection. And I wanted to reiterate that because it's so fundamentally important to understanding this story, because it can be extremely chaotic, and that's where I think a lot of my complaints lie, which I'll elaborate on further. But let me just paint an image for you so you get the idea of what Fire Punch is somewhat like. Imagine yourself in a world that is completely iced over. It is freezing, snowing, and icy 24/7. And I don't mean just a drop in temperature. I mean, if you walk outside and stay out there for longer than 5 minutes, you're most likely going to die. How do you think the world would respond to this? Especially if it happened extremely quickly. The world is now covered covered in internal ice and snow. The world doesn't respond. If anything, the world dies rather quickly and only a percentage of people actually survive. In some sense, it's basically an extinction event. It's very difficult to prepare for something like that even when you know it's coming, but when you don't know it's coming and the world just changes instantly, you either have to adapt extremely quickly or die off like everyone else. So the world of Fire Punch is cold and miserable, and people are trying to survive within it by whatever means. And mind you, when you're trying to survive within such fierce temperatures, it's extremely difficult. You're not going to have any sort of agricultural sense. You're not going to be able to grow any sort of plants or food or even go out hunting properly for specific animals that have large quantities of meat. So any sort of food that you could think of is most likely not going to work because of how uninhabitable and unlivable some of these places are. So the people within it have to survive by whatever means, even if that includes cannibalism. This is only the world of Fire Punch, but what happens when we start adding in other things? Agni, our main character, is one that is extremely interesting and the central pillar to this whole story. He is a character alongside his sister Luna that have regeneration abilities. Now, the regeneration ability is different between them. Agni is almost instant, basically one step away from being immortal. Luna takes a lot longer for her to regenerate anything. And mind you, this regeneration has no side effects or anything along those lines. Agni can cut off his arm and regenerate it instantly, which is what you as a reader are introduced into right at the beginning. These very two things, the harsh and unlivable conditions of Fire Punch's world and the lengths that people will go through to survive this winter wonderland. Agni, with his regeneration ability, lives in a very small town that is just trying to survive. Obviously, because of no food and the size of their town specifically, he just cuts off his arms and limbs and feeds them to everyone within the community. As much as he has to bear the pain of getting everything cut off, it's worth it. Not only does his sister take too long to regenerate and could probably help him out, but he's still taking her share of the burden as well. He insists the community can eat, she can eat, and everyone can survive by cannibalizing on Agni. All of this is within basically the first chapter. It's a very hefty thing to come to terms with, but you somewhat understand the situation in itself, and you can justify it, which I think is rather impressive because cannibalism isn't the most easiest thing to justify, or at least it's very generic to justify it, but the way it's gone about, it's not actually the main focus of the events. It's not something that you're inherently following along to see what's happening. You kind of expect it to happen, to be honest. Instead, you more so are focusing on Agni and the sacrifices he has to make to provide all of this food for this amount of people. But they do throw in a curveball regarding the cannibalism, and they throw it in very quickly. It's a moral curveball, which makes you actually question your comfortable, justified nature within the first chapter when you actually met with it. Because by this point, you're somewhat comfortable, you're a handful of chapters in, and you understand why he's doing it. And if I was in the position and there was no food and it was between life or death, I too may potentially cannibalize. You may find your own position within there, but that moral curveball comes in swinging and you're kind of taken back a little bit. This moral curveball is the setup for the rest of the story. Morality and the consequences for it, and having a specific type of morals in this type of very vicious and volatile world. It's very lawless. There's obviously bandits and everything going around, raping, pillaging, and killing individuals when and wherever they please. So basically the power rules this type of world, and power usually comes with community. The bigger your community, the more fierce you are and the more power and control you have. But obviously with communities and trying to survive, you can imagine the food shortage, the difficulties of providing some sort of nation-like structures and buildings and electricity. How could you even provide something like that within such a world? If you're already thinking of potentially disgusting things, you're basically correct. This is what the world has basically created and resorted to. So you can see why the moral curveball plays a much bigger picture, especially within the long run. The important thing about this and Agni and nihilism is that they all go hand in hand with one another. Agni's town gets completely obliterated by a very specific character called Doma. And what Doma has is an ability himself, not a regeneration ability, but an ability that is fire-based, which is honestly pretty handy in a world that's covered in snow and ice. This fire, however, is basically eternal. It's a hellfire. It's something that does not go out until the object that it is burning is completely completely destroyed, and you can probably see where I'm already going with this. Agni being one step away from being immortal and being able to regenerate at whatever lengths he can up against a fire that is impossible to put out until the object is completely gone. Combine those two and you have the main character, Fire Punch. Agni set on fire by Doma's flames, flames that do not extinguish or go out, and someone that is constantly regenerating within it. Someone that unfortunately can't die. After witnessing the closest people to him burn to death in probably the most horrible way you can imagine, this story steps down into nihilism once again. A burden to live. And this is where the story truly kind of takes its form and shape and shows just how morally, mentally, and emotionally sick and twisted it can be. Now, some things are very surface level and other things are rather depthly, but Agni as a main character is both funny enough surface level, but if you look deeper into what he has to offer, he is a very well crafted and meticulously handled type of character. The amount of attention to detail that goes into him, his mental state, his emotions is very specific, and you can go through the whole story and not even pay attention to that, which is a reason why I say he's both a surface level character, very simplistic and shallow, but is also rather depthly, has a incredible amount of growth and development in a lot of different ways that can go completely unnoticed. But before you can even get to that, he has to go through the hurdles and burdens of torture. And I'm talking about torture that lasts for so many years because of the burden of people asking him to live. He pushes through. It is definitely saddening to see, somewhat even sickening, seeing him trying to adapt and trying to regenerate with these flames that are covering his body that will not go out. It's a pain that he never gets used to, a pain that never disappears. It took him so many years just to keep consciousness. It took him so many more years to start moving a couple of fingers, and then so many more years being able to think and speak and walk, and before you know it, it took him a very long time of torture, torment, and absolute agony and pain to truly be the person that he is. And mind you, the only reason that he is that individual is because of a burden, because of a last dying wish, desire that propels him into a completely different realm to get revenge on Doma, person that killed everyone and set him on fire. Quite a shallow thing to go through that much torture for, but understandable. All of this stuff seems extremely overwhelming, but it's pretty much only the first 10 chapters. And you can see how nihilism is pretty much the core center and theme for absolutely everything that branches out into every single facet that you can think of. From Agni to his regeneration ability that makes him almost immortal, to the flames that are burning him constantly and putting him in so much consistent agony and pain and suffering, to the world that he is surrounded in, which is cold and deathly and completely uninhabitable, to the obnoxious people that live within it, which on one hand are trying to survive and then the other trying to morally justify other people alongside themselves to do all of these hideous things to survive. So many different things. It's played upon extremely well and the characters represent those things extremely well. It's without a doubt in my mind that Fire Punch does not hold back. It shows the flaws in human nature. It shows what such a vicious world can create and how people react and perceive different things. In this world, Agni being set on fire is both viewed as a god for the weak and innocent and a devil to the powerful. That in itself says a lot about the story and the societies or the minimalistic construct of politics that takes place within it. Power is what rules this world, and the weak get trampled upon, they get used, to the point where society itself has kind of reduced itself to slaves. And when I say slaves, I mean to the most horrendous degree. Human sacrifices, detrimental work labor, things that are basically not even human, nor are they even treated like humans. They're treated as fuel, they're treated as below human. And this is from people with power that are trying to uphold these cities, these laws, these situations. They're providing a small amount of comfort for the suffering of a large amount of people that aren't even viewed as human. They're just tools or fuel to provide for the whole city, to provide for the powerful people. So to them, Agni is a god. He is a savior because he's on this path of revenge, and Doma working closely with these powerful people in these large city structures. His fire that is so warm and unknown within such a cold world is viewed as such a godly and heavenly heavenly gift. But then to the people of power, the people that he's going up against, he's also viewed as a person that's so evil and malicious and devilish. Yet in reality, he just has a simple revenge. Agni is probably the most simple-minded individual throughout this whole story. But his determination and his will to not give up is what continues him forward. Very similar to the Terminator, to be honest. It's kind of a very odd comparison, but he just continues walking. He can be sliced up into tiny body pieces, thrown around in so many different directions, and he will regenerate himself and come back. The amount of incredible fights that he gets into, the people that he actually meets that are very enthralling and rather enjoyable. Togata for me is a character that I absolutely love. I think their appearance and acknowledgement within the story is vital to Agni's growth and understanding of himself. He learns a lot of different things from Togata, and as much as Togata isn't necessarily explored as an individual or as a character all too much, the amount we do find out about them specifically is very prominent and impactful and relevant, to be completely honest. It's stuff that you can easily understand, and it brings back this sort of familiarity that is non-existent within such a chaotic story that is Fire Punch. That people have these personal and internal struggles and issues that they have to face even when they're in this world of depressing, suffering, cold nature. I should also mention that Togata is a bit of an anomaly themselves, but a very impressive one. I wish they were played upon a lot more and even expanded upon a lot more, but their story and how they're connected to Agni is very specific and even at points very beautiful. Now, even though I have been kind of talking for a little bit now, and I apologize for me rambling on so much, I do have complaints. I have some very massive issues with Fire Punch that lead the conclusion to be very unsatisfying, which, to be honest, is something that you probably don't want to hear. Having such an incredible story and speaking about it in so many different aspects and so many great things within it, Agni's mental state is something that's not even played upon within the story, but so incredibly depthly and just enjoyable that I personally want to make a video just on Agni and his mind because of how interesting it is and how much enduring of torture he's gone through has morphed and manipulated his brain to be almost a completely different individual. All of these great things are a precursor to some of the most weirdest and bizarre concepts implemented within a story. And to be honest, they're not even that inherently bizarre. It's more like the way they are used and weaponized is bizarre and kind of out of nowhere. I would pretty much call this the final phase of the story because it's led in with a massive reveal. This reveal isn't inherently shocking, but it does open up your point of view a little bit further and your understanding to a lot of different things. You know the story is going to change rather drastically, you're just not really sure on how. And I can imagine reading this weekly, this was a pretty crazy thing to experience, but reading it in succession and going through it, it was the most over-the-top stuff that you could implement. I should mention the reason I didn't like it is not because of the things actually being implemented. That's not the sole reason. I actually think the things being added were rather interesting, even unique, very over the top, but for me they were just misplaced and weren't timed correctly. The reason I don't enjoy them is because of the polarizing shift it kind of gives the first half of the story. That is the biggest problem I have with the final moments of the story, is that even though it gives you a completely different understanding of what's going on within Fire Punch, it also elevates things beyond a comprehensive understanding. And it feels like Fujimoto is just doing whatever he wants because he wants to try different things, and not because he's trying to write a coherent story that makes some sort of valuable sense. I say that with respect because once again, I think the ideas that he did implement were rather interesting. I'd love to see them within a different medium or within a story that is centered more around this. But how all of that compares and contrasts to the beginning of the story is almost night and day, and makes for a very weird shift and sometimes even devalues the beginning of the story, which is not something that you specifically want. So by the end of the story, unfortunately, you're left with a very odd, over-the-top, overwhelming, misplaced escalation into such drastic things that completely overpower the beauty of the first half of Fire Punch, and you're kind of just left with a dissatisfied taste within your mouth. This is what the story basically boiled up to, and that's that. To bring this video somewhat to a conclusion, because I feel like I've been talking for a very long time, Fire Punch is an enthralling experience. It's very interesting, it's very unique, and truly has this massive understanding to how nihilism works within stories, creating such a depressing, dark, and dangerous world that is filled with so much death and despair and agony. Every single concept, character, emotion, idea thrives within here, connected to the most deepest degree. It's truly impressive how much each individual thing plays off one another. It's not something that you can write easily. You have to know what you're doing and truly understand the meaning of what you're trying to create. It goes to offer two variable reading experiences, one that's surface level and very enjoyable, and the second one that has a whole lot of meaning, a whole lot of depth, and such flirtatious detail for mental health, for so many phenomenal atmospheres and themes and concepts, and is a really great exploration into a lot of different things, if you want to go into it, of course. However, the second half of the story derails that rather heavily. It completely twists everything that I've just talked about and kind of creates something very overwhelming, overshadowing, overbearing, over the top. And while the ideas are definitely interesting, the way it's utilized and how it's contrasted with the first half of the story is very polarizing and not to a enjoyable or good degree. Any sort of consistency you thought you did have is no longer a thing, and the story just goes and spirals off into whatever it wants. Personally, I enjoyed Fire Punch. I enjoyed what it had to offer, the reading experience, the things being crafted and created, and Fujimoto's approach to a lot of these things were truly impressive. It's a very difficult story to write. Unfortunately, the second half kind of lost me and I just wasn't really feeling it. I think the only way that something like that stuff could actually work is with more time and expanding upon your own characters, your own world, your own abilities in a more natural and free-flowing type of manner, instead of trying to force it in and expand upon it at such a rapid pace. I'm glad to see that a lot of the difficulties or problems within Fire Punch are actually somewhat either redesigned or thought about rather deeply within Chainsaw Man. He has not necessarily, at least so far, made the same mistake, and I can see why a lot of people are extremely concerned for Chainsaw Man's future. He spent a lot more time grounding Chainsaw Man and keeping it as consistent as possible, and while it has elevated to such incredible lengths, it still grounds itself right after it, something that Fire Punch struggled to do. Also, on a side note, I should definitely probably mention that the artwork within Fire Punch is beyond incredible. It's almost the perfect artwork to depict all of this suffering and agony and despair. It's incredibly graphic, gritty, detailed, simplistic. When it wants to be certain things, it will thrive within them, and overall is such a beautiful thing to feast your eyes upon. If you do plan to read Fire Punch, take your time with it. Don't over expect things, don't overhype yourself, just go into it very open-minded, and by the end of it, you'll either really enjoy the experience that you got and love the things that you think are done well, or genuinely dislike how the story jumps between different things and not really find it enjoyable whatsoever. So with that being said, that is basically it. I apologize for this video being so extremely long. Hopefully it's not too overwhelming or overbearing. But if you have read Fire Punch, I would love to hear your thoughts. What do you think about it? How do you feel? Do you think something similar to me, or do you have your own opinions about it? I'd love to hear your thoughts. But I want to thank you all for watching. Hope you enjoyed. Drink plenty of water, and I will see you in the next one. Goodbye.